Hi, everyone. I hope all of you had a happy and healthy 4th of July. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And for me, in addition to hamburgers with my family, we, like I think thousands of others, did subscribe to Disney Plus and watched that absolutely incredible performance of Hamilton, which led me, of course, to think about our country's past and to wonder about where we're going in the future. But one thing for sure, uh, energy will continue to be a critical and dominant driver of global ambition and policy, and the role of electricity fostering economic development all over the world is a fascinating topic, and it's told very well by our guest, Robert Bryce. Robert is the author of a new book, A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, and he's going to be joined by one of our council directors, Jay Young. I want to give special thanks to Vistra Energy for generously supporting today's conversation. So Jay Young, good friend, lives just up the road from me, and he recently retired as a captain in the Navy Reserves, where he commanded 2 Navy Reserve intelligence units. Jay is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a very proud graduate of Yale University. He also received his MA from King's College at the University of London, and a PhD from Ohio State University. Jay, I never asked you, what's your PhD? What did you write your PhD, your doctoral dissertation on?
Military history. It's about Latin America and the Cold War.
All right, well then let's move to electricity. So I turn it over to you. Look forward to listening to both of you. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Again, welcome Robert Bryce to the World Affairs Council. Virtually, we're glad to have you. And Robert, just a little bit more introduction before we get into the discussion here. Robert's been writing about energy, power, and innovation and politics for 3 decades. He's delivered over 500 or 300 invited or keynote lectures to groups of all kinds, ranging from the Sydney Institute to something I know well, the Marine War College. His articles have been printed in numerous publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And he's appeared in a variety of media outlets, ranging from Fox News to Al Jazeera. He's the author of 6 books, including Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future, and Smaller, Faster, Lighter, Denser, Cheaper, How Innovation Keeps Proving the Catastrophists Wrong. His latest book, which is what we're discussing today, is called A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, which was published in March by his longtime publisher, Public Affairs. On his website, you can also see his new feature-length documentary, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that has received rave reviews, and is now available on, again, multiple streaming platforms, including iTunes, Amazon Prime, and others. So let's just go right to it. Robert, again, welcome. We're glad to have you here, sir.
Thanks, Jay.
Would very much, what I thought we'd do is have you, if you could, kind of give us a sense as to, I know you've been a long time commentator and writer on energy. Talk to us a little bit about what brought you to write this book. And I think you were going to provide a little bit of background on what is a very complex subject to kind of ground us in some of the key themes that are discussed in the books.
Sure. So you're right. I've been writing about the energy business for a long time. My first book was on Enron, published almost 20 years ago now. But I saw a piece that was in the New York Times about 5 years ago or so, talking about the power problems in Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, and how the country is still desperately short of electricity. And it jogged one of these moments, and you think, oh, where have I heard that before? And I remember I think it was in the 70s, and I was watching 60 Minutes, and Morley Safer was in Lagos. And I remember it. I tried to find it online, and I couldn't, but I remember him being in Lagos and talking about the electric grid, and he was somewhere in Lagos in a warehouse and looking at a lot of lead acid batteries. And there was this kind of a little smirk on his face, like, well, this is what they do for electricity in Lagos. And I thought, in 40 years, it hadn't changed, not a bit. And why is that? Why is this country that has all kinds of oil wealth, why are they still electricity poor? And that led me, then I got a contract for this book. And then I thought, well, I was writing the book. I thought, well, I'll just make a documentary at the same time. How hard can that be? Which was pretty hard, actually. But the gist of it was when I decided, well, I'm going to go around the world and look at the world through the lens of electricity. So we went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, Colorado, New York, all focused on, well, why are some places electricity rich and some places electricity poor? And that became the focal point of the book, which looking at the world through the lens of electricity, which is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy.
Exactly. And one of the things that you talk about a lot in your book, or at least a couple of chapters, which I think people in this country tend to take for granted because it's somewhat removed in time from us, is how this country became electrified. The things that were done by various governments, and particularly the role played by LBJ and the New Deal, to help lay the foundation for the electrical grid and prosperity that we have today. So talk a little bit about that and how the United States got to where it is today and the importance of electricity in our own national development.
Sure. And just a quick, foreshadowing of what's to come. I have 11 slides. I'm going to show a very, very few PowerPoint slides that kind of give some numbers to the texture, to the challenge that we face globally in terms of electrification. And I have a slide where I show Lyndon Johnson, Sam Rayburn, Burton Wheeler, and George Norris, who were the key architects, Lyndon Johnson aside, but Rayburn, Norris, and Wheeler were the key architects of two pieces of legislation that passed 1935 and 1936, the Public Utility Holding Company Act and the Rural Electrification Act, both of which fundamentally changed the trajectory of rural America. When FDR ran for president in 1932, only 1 in 10 farms in America, farms and ranches in America, had electricity. By 1950, that number was 9 out of 10. And so America has fundamentally been changed. The face of the United States has fundamentally been changed by rural electrification. The electric grid in the United States has the most diffused ownership of any electric grid in the world. And the rural cooperatives, now there are 800 of them or so, are living remnants of the New Deal.
Well, let's talk a little bit about it. You can use your slides here, I think, to kind of illustrate some of the points. Sure. The challenge that the United States has made an investment in some respects, but talk a little bit about the challenge that you've seen that the rest of the world faces in closing that gap and beginning to put in place the electrical capacity that it's going to need in order to sustain growth and
Sure.
kind of move a lot of these countries into the next phase economically from a
Sure. Thanks.
standpoint.
This is the first of just 11 slides. The woman on the left is Rahena Jamadar. I met her in 2016. She's standing outside of her home in Majlishpur, which is a very modest agricultural village in West Bengal in India. To your right is Joyashree Roy, who's an economics professor at Kolkata University. She shared in the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. She was a member of and is still a member of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and so she's edited some of the reports that they've issued. But in any case, the background on that is that's the background. But so when I was talking with Rahena, we traveled to this small village about an hour's drive southeast of Kolkata in West Bengal. And Joyashree was interpreting for me from Bengali. And I started talking to Rahena, and it was clear that she was a very bright woman and very gracious. And when she learned we wanted to talk about electricity, she said, sure. So when I met her, she was 44 years old. She had had her first child when she was 16. She first got electricity in her home 14 years earlier. So she'd lived more than half of her life effectively in the dark. So I asked her about her life. What difference did electricity mean in her life? And she said, well, now she could use a grinder in the kitchen. So she didn't have to grind spices by hand, which made things easier. And of course, there were lights in the house at night, and that was important to her children. She had 3 of them. And she was very proud of the fact that one of her daughters was going to the university in Kolkata. So we talked a little bit more. And then I stopped her and I said, okay, so Rahena, if you had had electricity when you were a child, would you have gone to the university as well? And she, not a half of a second pause. She nodded her head to the right, as a lot of people in West Bengal do. And she said, yes, I would have gone. And it was as though I was asking her if the sun was going to come up in the east in the morning. And she said, well, of course I would have. And it was a few days later when I was in Jaipur and it came to me that darkness kills human potential. And electricity nourishes it. And there are billions of people like Rahena Jamadar who've been left in the dark and not had their promise fulfilled. Let me show you the next slide because this will put some texture to it. So this is what I call the trifurcated donut. This is World Bank data. I trifurcated the world into three sections: the high watt world, the low watt world, and the unplugged world. High watt world, that's us. These are the places where electricity consumption is more than 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. Why 4,000 kilowatt hours? Because above that, you don't see a significant increase in living standards. And low watt world is kind of the intermediate range of electricity consumption. Unplugged, that's less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. Why 1,000 kilowatt hours? Because that's roughly the amount of electricity my old kitchen refrigerator used.
Yeah.
So
that's your benchmark. Yeah.
That's the benchmark.
Yeah.
Electricity is hard to understand. So another trifurcated donut, putting some texture to it. Okay, so how big is this population? Well, 3.3 billion people in the world today are living in places where electricity consumption is less than what's used by an average American refrigerator. 3.3 billion. 4 out of 10 people in the world live in the unplugged world. And what's interesting to me as well is the religious affiliations here, which we again use World Bank data. Christians are fairly evenly distributed around the world in between the high watt, low watt, and unplugged worlds. The Islamic population is heavily concentrated in the unplugged world. Next slide. Why does that matter? Well, because if you look at this slide, which is Pew Research, the growth, global population growth, is going to happen dramatically in the Islamic countries. Now, if I'm not going to talk about the clash of civilizations and whether I think that it is inevitable that we're going to have conflict with Islamic countries, Islamic people. But if you look at the growth trends, we're going to add over 1 billion Islamic people over the next 40 years. And so that the Islamic and Christian populations by 2060, according to Pew's projections, will be roughly the same. And when you look around the world, and Jay, you've served in the military, American military forces are continue to be deployed in Islamic countries, and particularly in Islamic countries that are electricity poor. So this is a trend that I think is just, it's critical that we be aware of and pay attention to and think about how this challenge is met. Next slide, please. This is a Library of Congress photograph. I love the Library of Congress's photo collection. They're available for free. These are 2 women in rural Kentucky in 1916, and they're washing clothes by hand. Hans Rosling, the late Swedish demographer, estimated that today there are 5 billion people in the world today walking around with clothes that have been washed by hand, which means that there are roughly 2.5 billion women and girls who are still washing clothes by hand in a tub like this. And if you haven't seen the YouTube video with Hans Rosling talking about the washing machine, do it. He talks about his grandmother coming to watch his mother use her electric washing machine for the first time. And his grandmother was astounded by it. Next slide, please. I've mentioned these guys before. Lyndon Johnson, of course, is on the left. He's one of my political heroes. Deeply flawed man. Vietnam was his great sin, but the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts were his great redemption. And here he is on Sam Rayburn's birthday, I believe in 1957, kissing him on the head. Rayburn, as many of you probably know, is from Bonham, Texas, right. Born on a cotton farm, raised in poverty, and knew what it was like to live in a home without electricity. In fact, that was how he grew up. And so his famous quote was, "I want my people out of the dark and I want them out of the mud." So it was Rayburn, Burton Wheeler from Montana, and George Norris from Nebraska. Norris was a tremendous legislator, probably the most famous legislator ever to come out of Nebraska, was responsible for Nebraska having a unicameral legislature. But those 3 men were the FDR's chief allies in Congress to get rural electrification going. Next slide, please. This is in West Bengal, in India, in Majlishpur, the same village where I interviewed Rahena Jamadar. This image was shot in 2016, a full century after the image that I showed you earlier of the women in Kentucky. Why does electricity matter? Why does it matter to women and girls? Electricity frees women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. Without electricity, women and girls are effectively household slaves, hauling water, fetching wood for fires to cook, and washing clothes by hand. And when you think about this challenge globally, who does it, the electrification challenge, if we're serious about women's rights, if we're serious about inequality, if we're serious about climate change, we have to be laser focused on electricity. Next slide, please. So this, again, I'm just repeating the trifurcated donut, but the question is, where will we get the juice? Is it going to be renewables? I don't think so. I think that the scale of the challenge is so large, there's simply no way for renewables to meet the challenge. And I have a long chapter in the book where I talk about the friction that is already occurring across the United States about the siting of wind projects. All kinds of energy infrastructure is difficult to site, but when you look at what's happening in the United States in particular, you're seeing a backlash against the wind industry from Vermont to Hawaii. Today in Vermont, you cannot build new wind capacity. Bernie Sanders' home state, you cannot build wind turbines in Vermont, even though Bernie Sanders has been promoting an all renewable program. So in my view, very briefly, natural gas and nuclear are the ways we're going to get more electrification globally and address the climate issue, because natural gas and nuclear are low carbon, affordable, and scalable.
Good.
Next slide, please. Just a couple more. This is a little quick ad for my new documentary. It's on all of your favorite streaming platforms. I'm really proud of this film. It's the best film ever made about electricity. And I'm just going to say that without fear of being contradicted. It's 80 minutes, and we did 40 interviews, including with Rahena Jamadar. And then one last slide. Again, this is from Majlish-Bukur. I love this image. This was shot by my wife, Lauren, in Majlish-Bukur. If you care about electricity, and if you care about women, you care about inequality. These are the women that are living in the Islamic world. Majlish-Bukur is predominantly Muslim, that are living still effectively in the dark. And so I'll end it there. That's the end of my slideshow, but I'm pleased to be able to show that.
No, thank you. Having been to India many times, I can definitely attest to the conditions that you describe in many of the major cities that I visited, which did not include Kolkata, but many of the other major ones, including Mumbai. Let's talk about that challenge that
Sure.
bring up. I mean, you mentioned in your book a couple of things about, some of the foundations that are necessary for a power grid or electrical grid to be put in and work effectively. And you talk about three things: integrity, capital, and fuel. The most capital intensive industry in the world is electricity. So what are the challenges that these countries face in putting in grids, aside from the technical challenge that are going to be required to ensure that they are successful, in getting a sustained capability up and running?
That's, and that's one of the things that I wrestled with for a long time, Jay, and thinking about, well, why is it that some countries are effective in electrification and others are failing? And I'm not going to say that the technology is trivial. It's not. Running an electric grid is very technical enterprise. You have to keep voltage within a very thin range to make sure that that you don't hurt your equipment or the thing doesn't collapse. But the key, you're right about those three factors, and the most important one is integrity. I wrestled with that too, because I thought, well, is it lack of theft? But no, the system has to be legit. And one of the things that I write about in the book is what happened in Iraq. If you look at World Bank data, when Saddam Hussein was in power, and Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, that I can say that without fear of being contradicted, but no one stole electricity under Saddam. Right? Because if you got caught, bad things were likely to happen.
Right.
But after the second Iraq war and after Saddam was captured, the electric grid in Iraq, and now it was badly damaged during the first Iraq war, but electricity theft skyrocketed after Saddam was captured. Why? Because the people in Iraq knew, well, there are no cops on the beat. We saw similar things in India, where up to half of the electricity in rural India is simply stolen. We saw it in Beirut, particularly in the Hezbollah-controlled areas of Beirut, where in those parts of the city, EDL, Électricité du Liban, they effectively had to give away the electricity they produced, because Hezbollah, backed of course by the Iranians, said, well, these are our people, they're not going to pay electricity. They're not going to pay for their electric bills. So the entire grid in Lebanon was crippled because the system lacked integrity. People weren't paying their bills. So if the people using the electricity don't pay for it, or the people who are running the grid steal from it, the whole thing falls apart. So integrity, capital, and fuel, but you can get you only get capital if you have integrity, and you can only buy fuel if you have capital. So integrity is the absolute essential commodity.
When you say integrity, one of the questions we have, from one of our participants is there any connection that you see between electricity access and democratic institutions in participation, or do authoritarian regimes at least have some ability to do this early on if they can, like Saddam did, pretty much tell the population what to do? How does that connection, if there is one, actually play out in terms of, sustaining an effective electrical capability?
Well, I'm not going to say that democracy is essential, because I've been to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait as well. They have lots of electricity, and they're autocracies. They're maybe kleptocracies, royalties. They're royal governments. So but the systems there have integrity, right?
Right.
So it's not essential that you have democracy, but it is essential that people think the system is legit, right? And that they pay their bills.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's about, I think it's this idea, I coined a term, esprit de grid, right? That people they have to pay for what they use. And if they don't, the system is corrupted.
Okay, so it's a function of legitimacy and a belief that the system is somehow going to deliver an effective service if they pay for it.
Or if it's not necessarily, a system that has legitimacy. I mean, the Saudis didn't vote in the king, right?
Right.
But at least the system itself functions as a whole, right? And that there isn't just lawlessness, because that was that was the situation in Lebanon. And what happened was that you saw in Lebanon what was commonly known as the generator mafia, where you have local generators will set up in different neighborhoods. Now it's common in Baghdad, where local generators will set up their own electric grids, and they maintain integrity in their grid. Right. Because they know who their customers are, and they know who's paying and who isn't.
Well, it's an interesting point. I want to come back to this idea of dispersed grids, and
sure.
Because I think you bring that up as something that might be a wave of the future. But I want to come back to the question. I mean, this is a massive challenge. I mean, I think you said 16 years we expect the energy requirements to double, or the electricity requirements to double as more countries come online. And I think one of the things that, and ours will continue to increase as well, because one of the things you point out is that, in contrast to what probably a lot of people may initially think, the modern economy that we have is heavily dependent on electricity in terms of many of the key things. Talk a little bit about some of the key things in our economy now that are going to become increasing, or going to, continue to, keep a high demand for electricity.
Well, the first one is marijuana.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
It's one of the things one of the reasons we went to Denver, where the fastest growing element of the electric consumption in the city of Denver was the marijuana trade, the cannabis business, the legal cannabis business. And that has been identified. Morningstar a couple of years ago said, where's electric growth going to happen? In the marijuana business.
Right.
One of the things I've also tracked is the amount of illicit growing of marijuana, where people are stealing electricity, which has been rampant in California. Even though electricity even though cannabis is legal in California, the regulatory regime around it has made the price so high that people still grow it and sell it on the black market. But the other, of course, I think is clearly the issue of data centers and big tech. Some of the fastest growing areas of electric demand in the United States are from companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook. I call them the big five. They use as much electricity by my calculations as Denmark, over 30 terawatt hours per year. So, and their electricity consumption has been doubling every 3 years. So this is a massive quantity of electricity.
And they've, one of the things I found fascinating when you talked about this was that they have, despite all their kind of, public posturing around, the need for renewable energy, they have set up their own backup grids to ensure that these massive data centers, one of which we have an example on from Amazon on the screen now, have the ability to ensure a consistent stream of power, none of which are even remotely hooked to renewables. That I didn't know they had that level of backup.
Well, they have to. And that's part of this idea of integrity, right? That they have to assure their own grid has integrity. So, because they can't afford to have a blackout. So every data center that Amazon owns, every one that's operated by some of these big REITs, in fact, they're REITs that just provide service to data centers, they all have their own backup diesel gen sets on site. of multiple megawatts. So this idea that, oh, we're just running on, Apple claimed they're running one of their data centers solely with solar energy. Well, no, they're not. And if they have a blackout, then their grid, whatever powers that data center, is the electricity that's produced by that grid. Google, Tulsa's my hometown. Google has a big data center in Pryor, Oklahoma. They buy their electricity from the Grand River Dam Authority. Well, the GRDA has wind. They have natural gas, and whatever electricity is flowing at that time on the GRDA's grid is what is consumed at the data center in Pryor. It's not just wind. So, but they all have big diesel gensets on site because they just simply cannot afford to have a blackout.
Well, and as we move more toward a transportation network that's increasingly reliant on, say, electrical cars, then that's going to be just another element of demand generation. Is that a fair point?
Sure, it is. Now, how much EVs will grow. I haven't shorted Tesla, thank God, because I would have been crushed had I done so. But right now, I just don't see the case for electric cars growing, particularly with an economic downturn and Hertz bankruptcy and the rest of it. That the world is awash in cheap gasoline and cheap used cars. So I don't see a lot of demand really for new electrification of the automobile fleet, but it will happen, and that will absolutely will increase the amount of electricity consumed.
Well, I want to transition a little bit and talk about this issue of how we get from point A to point B to meet this massive demand. And critical to that discussion is the discussion around the energy mix. And you talk a lot about the various sources of energy, the portfolio of things that we all know: nuclear, various types of renewable, natural gas, coal.
Sure.
There are a lot of questions we're getting about that issue, and I want to kind of work those in and talk a little bit about your views. You talk about hey, renewables have certain significant drawbacks, and you have a place where you talk about scale and density as being essential to provide really effective energy production. Talk a little bit about let's start with renewables, because I think that's the thing people are focused on. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the key two renewables that people are focused on that you've seen in your studies?
Sure. One of the slides I didn't include I could have put in that slide deck was when I was in Lebanon. We went into the Shuf Mountains, southeast of Beirut, and went to a resort area called Kirzai. They went completely solar and storage. They had solar panels from China that were taking Lebanese sunlight and charging batteries that were designed in Bulgaria and manufactured in India. So it was this incredible international, I called it a United Nations of electrons, right? But it was an example of how a microgrid using solar can be successful. Now, why was it successful there? Because they were competing with diesel-fired generation units, which are incredibly expensive, right? When you, on a per kilowatt hour basis, you're talking 30 cents, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So solar and storage in that area made a lot of sense. And you're seeing big growth absolutely in solar. And I live in Austin. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar on the roof of my house here. Why did I put it on? Because I got big tax credits to do so.
With the subsidy.
So, I mean, I'm opposed to all energy subsidies unless I'm getting them, right? So I took them.
The finest American tradition, yeah.
I'm going to cuss them unless I'm getting them, right? So that's the way it is. But I don't have storage. Why would I buy batteries? I don't want to mess with that, right? But so I'm bullish on solar. I think solar is going to continue to grow. There's simply no question about it. And what we're seeing is a lot of competition now between natural gas-fired electricity in the United States and renewables. Wind energy, of course, still produces far more electricity, far more watt hours in the United States and around the world than does solar, but I see a lot of friction for wind. I've written recently a piece in Forbes about the state of New York, which has big renewable energy mandates, but the state just approved a very large wind project, 340 megawatts, called Alley Cat, over the objections of local communities. So this friction is basically a function of basic physics, which is the low power density of solar and wind. Solar has 10 times the power density of wind. Wind energy's power density is 1 watt per square meter. Yes, it doesn't produce any CO2, but the problem is that you need tremendous amounts of land to produce electricity at the terawatt hour scale that we need in the United States. So we're already seeing that friction. In fact, Bloomberg's run a couple of articles just in the last few months about the resistance to wind energy expansion in Europe. But mind you, it's not just about the siting of the solar panels and the wind turbines. It's also about the transmission lines. And these are the same issues of land use. Who gets to decide what gets built and where? And just last week, I think it was in the Sandhills in Nebraska, federal judge halted a big transmission project that was under development there. So this idea, and well, we also saw just, I think yesterday, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was stopped. So energy infrastructure in general is facing a lot of land use conflicts. But we're going to see more of those when it comes to renewables.
Well, before we kind of transition into the discussion of nuclear, and I found your discussion fascinating about Indian Point, and kind of it represented sort of almost a lost era in how Americans looked at the construction of certain types of capabilities, in particular nuclear. One of the questions we got from one of our participants was about Germany's Energiewende, I think it was called. They really went all out to move toward as rapidly. They shut their nuclear power plants down. They went all out toward renewables. And I was over there at a conference maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and they were having problems. And what lessons can we or should we draw from Germany, highly advanced economies, rapid attempt to move toward renewals, and what that might portend for kind of an energy strategy in general?
Sure. Well, I think it is a clear warning when you look at what's happened in Germany, and particular the electricity price spikes that have occurred in Germany, where the German residential customers are paying some of the highest electricity prices in the world,
right?
Not just in Europe, but in the world, on the order of 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Average residential price in the U.S. now is about 13 cents. So 3 times the price of electricity here in the U.S. And those rate hikes have been driven by the Energiewende. And further, this idea that they were going to suddenly quit after Fukushima, quit nuclear energy and go solely to renewables. Well, the wind energy industry in Germany has effectively been stopped in its tracks. I mean, because of this local resistance. Same thing in Norway. And just in the last few weeks, or I don't know if it's open yet, but there's a new coal-fired power plant that's going to open in Germany just this summer. So
wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
It's very Telln, I think, is the name of the power plant. But that's the other part of this whole idea about energy transitions and renewables that people forget, which is that coal still provides today. Coal's on the way out in the United States. We're becoming much more focused just solely on natural gas in the U.S., but coal globally still provides about 38% of all the electricity produced around the world. And in South Asia, coal plants are being built all in China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Japan is building 22 new coal-fired power plants.
Well, the Indians, they've got large coal reserves, and they're basically will tell you, hey, we can't get from point A to point B if we don't leverage these coal reserves. We can't get to the place where the people that you showed early on have got that consistent supply of electricity unless we are able to tap those coal reserves. So I think that's going to be something, again, people have to come to grips with, because coal is going to be with us, for a while, right?
And it's clear that is a decision that China has made as well, that the Chinese are not going to. That's a point I make in the book where I talk about, I have a whole chapter on coal, and Roger Pilkey Jr. is an academic at the University of Colorado. He calls it the iron law of climate, which is when governments and politicians have to choose between economic growth and climate policy, they'll always choose economic growth. And I think that's clearly what we're seeing in Japan. The Japanese are also, after Fukushima, trying to phase out their nuclear plants, but they know that they need abundant electricity to run their industry. So they're going to build modern coal plants. They're going to be using ultra supercritical, the most efficient form of coal combustion, but they're still coal-fired power plants. So why are they doing it? Well, it's not because they love CO2. It's not because they love coal. It's not because they hate the idea of the Kyoto Protocol. It's because they are going to prioritize having a cheap, abundant, reliable electricity over climate issues. And this is one of the chief, as I said, This is why we have to be laser focused on electricity. If we're serious about climate change, the electric sector is the biggest single source of CO2 emissions globally. So if we're going to be serious about it, well, then we need to get darn serious about nuclear, and we need to do it right away. But unfortunately, nuclear still doesn't have much political support.
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the things you talk about is that fact that nuclear's political support has bled away. There are other factors that have made nuclear, less attractive, but you can't get away from the physics, to use your phrase, that if you compared, and I think it's a really fascinating comparison, Indian Point's generation capacity and the kind of things it can do versus what it would take from a wind farm to replace that. Talk a little bit about the advantages of nuclear power and some of the problems it has faced in terms of the, not just the public perception, but some of the other things you raised with regard to cost. And also, how does it get past that? I mean, how are we going to get past that? Is there a way forward for nuclear?
Well, let me start with just a quick vignette about Indian Point, because that was one of the great joys of my job. I've been in journalism for, 30 years. And so I've been to coal mines, I've been to power plants, I've been in underground coal mines, above ground coal mines. I've been in steel factories. I've seen a lot of industry, geothermal plants, gas plants. But the trip that I took to Indian Point a couple of years ago was it was, as the Brits might say, gobsmacking. I mean, it was just a marvel of technology. Indian Point, the construction at Indian Point began in the 1950s, as memory serves. It was the same year Dwight Eisenhower launched the Interstate Highway program. There's a shot of Indian Point units 2 and 3.
Right there.
But that idea of thinking big and doing big infrastructure projects today is almost unthinkable. We don't do those kinds of projects anymore. But those plants were, built, in Unit 2 was 43 years old. It was just shut down in April, not because of decrepitude. It was not because the plant didn't work. It was because it was politically expedient for the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, to shut it down. And what has happened after the plant was closed? It's been replaced by gas-fired electricity. But just a quick vignette about being inside the turbine hall at Unit 2. So it's a 2,000 megawatt plant. Those two reactors at Indian Point provide 25%, or did 25% of the electricity used in New York.
Wow.
And at one point, I'm standing in the turbine hall, and you can see it at one place, the turbine shaft. So it spins about 1,800 RPM, and I write about this in the book. It spins about 1,800 RPM, and I stood there for a couple of minutes just watching it spin. And later I realized that one shaft was powering 1 out of every 8 elevators, 1 out of every 8 subway cars, 1 out of every 8 lights in the city of New York was running off that one spinning piece of steel. But today, nuclear it doesn't have any political, I'm not going to say any, there's very few political allies on Capitol Hill. The cost of new plants is simply too high, dramatically too high. And the public still isn't convinced, because they still, vast swaths of the public still want renewables. They like the idea of wind and solar, but they don't understand the basics about basic physics or land use.
But there's also this, and you point this out in the book as well, this belief that, nuclear is hugely dangerous. That, and you say that, look, I mean, if you look at the casualties that occurred, and, they were really almost non-existent in Fukushima, and very limited at the one in the Ukraine. So where does it, I mean, that's the other thing I think people are, you don't seem to have had, dangerous it's not, if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely. It's the safest form of electricity generation. And yet the public has been, I'll use the word, brainwashed to not like nuclear, right? And this is how Greenpeace came to prominence. What Sierra Club, they're all about climate change, but they're anti-nuclear. And to go back to your point about wind energy, and particularly to me, it's really instructive about the state of New York saying, we're going to mandate 70% renewable energy. Well, where are they going to put all those wind turbines? And in fact, what they're doing with the Alley Cat project in Allegheny and Cattaraugus counties in Western New York, those are 2 of the poorest counties in New York State. Well, is it just a coincidence that they're trying to ram through this massive wind project on 2 of the poorest counties in the state? I don't think it's a coincidence. But the problem is, again, back to basic physics. To replace the output of the Unit 2 reactor at Indian Point, or to the entirety of the electricity from Indian Point, which covers 1 square kilometer, would require covering 1,500 square kilometers with wind turbines.
Wow.
So, I mean, the power density numbers simply don't lie. And it's one of the other reasons why in natural gas, that's the other great attribute of natural gas is that, yeah, it emits CO2 during combustion. And yes, there's some methane leaking. And yes, no, people don't like pipelines and the rest of it. But the surface footprint of natural gas is very small. And in fact, it's on par with nuclear energy.
One of our listeners had a question with regard to nuclear energy. He said, is there progress being made on the fission versus fusion issue? Is that going to be one of the things that maybe helps nuclear get over the hump, or are there other things that might?
I'm approaching my dotage here, Jay. I'm turned 60 this year, and I've heard about fusion since I was a kid.
Yeah, right. Me too. Yeah.
My view is that, look, fission works and we don't need fusion. We can make fission work. But if we're going to make fission work at scale, we're going to need strong government backing. And and that's a problem in the United States because political power in the United States is pretty diffused. And so fission works. And I'm hopeful for some of the new breed of small modular reactors, SMRs.
Right.
But the problem again, and I can run down all the problems why I'm adamantly pro, and I can say I'm also adamantly pro-nuclear. My view on nuclear, if you're anti-nuclear power and you're anti-carbon dioxide, you're pro-blackout. Well, I'm anti-blackout and I'm pro-nuclear. I don't want the lights to go out, but I also recognize that the challenges that nuclear faces in terms of scale, and this is the point that I was going to get to, even if we came up with a small modular reactor or even a medium-sized reactor that was foolproof, that was fail-safe, that had passive safety, all of these other attributes that we want to deploy it at the terawatt scale. And that's where we need deployment at the terawatt scale. The United States today has about 1 terawatt, 1 trillion watts of generation capacity. That's what we need. We need to double effectively. We need to create the U.S. grid globally again to meet future demand. So we need it at that kind of scale. And that's the problem with nuclear, is making that scale up happen in a reasonable time frame.
Let's talk, fair point, but let's talk about, that foreign challenge. I mean,
sure.
Power diplomacy, if you will, and by that I mean the use of, going out and helping to finance various types of big power projects are staples now of certainly Chinese foreign policy in the One Belt, One Road. The Russians with nuclear and gas, both nuclear and gas. I mean, when I was in Europe, that's all they were talking about was their dependence and how to get off of it on Gazprom. If you were to advise the United States government on how they could put, or what kind of policy they should take to help promote energy development in a lot of these countries that need it so badly, and to deal with these alternatives that the Russians and the Chinese are putting out there, how should we go about that? What's kind of the best strategy for us to pursue in helping countries put in place a reliable and effective grid?
Well, I think one of the things has to be, and this is one of the unfortunate things that happened during the Obama administration, what we're already seeing with the World Bank is a refusal to provide financing for hydrocarbon projects, including hydrocarbon projects that involve power production. So the idea that the U.S., and so if I'm agnostic about the fuels, right, what would be the fuel that the U.S. would be promoting for electricity development in the developing world, the developing countries? It would be natural gas, right? But you have the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Export-Import Bank, now the World Bank saying, well, we're not going to finance any new coal plants. In fact, we're not going to finance any new natural gas plants. Well, wait a minute. That makes no sense, right? If we're serious about inequality, if we're serious about exporting American technology, American commodities, we need to be aggressively promoting American natural gas in the global economy, because right now in particular, it can compete and displace coal. So there's a win here that can be had both on the climate front and on the foreign trade front and the diplomacy front. But just to make a quick point, to follow up, Rosatom, the big Russian nuclear company, government owned, government backed, they're deploying nuclear plants all over the world. And Gazprom, if you remember, in December, just fired up the new Power of Siberia pipeline, a gas pipeline that is 5,000 miles long into China.
Into China, right? Exactly. I remember when they
So
signed that deal.
it's a massive $400 billion a year, $400 billion project over, I think, 3 decades. So the energy diplomacy is happening between with the Russians, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Turks. The Russians, well, of course, the Russians are trying to build the Bushehr reactor in Iran. So this is a very complex and important bit of diplomacy that's been underway for years.
Well, and we just don't seem, at least in the United States, to have fully, it seems, I know we've, helped deliver natural gas, LNG in particular. You talk about that a little bit, to Poland and one or two other places, but it doesn't seem like it's really worked its way into the firmament of American strategy and the ability to take these resources and use them effectively. To help these countries. I mean, I just don't see it as being as big a foreign policy priority as it. I think it needs to be based on the demand that you're talking about.
Well, and also remember the supply. What we've seen in the United States over the last 15 years is the biggest growth in energy supply in world history. I did some quick calculations. In fact, I was looking at this yesterday. Since 2005, the increase, just the increment of new energy production in the United States is greater than the entire energy use of India. We're talking about 33 exajoules. The BP Statistical Review started using exajoules, which no one knows what it is, but it's a big bunch of energy is what it is. It's roughly equal to 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So these are massive quantities of new energy production from the U.S. that the U.S. can now, some of which they can export around the world. But there are a lot of hurdles to that and a lot of competition. But to speak to what is happening, you see Shell has recently talked about using LNG to power in Vietnam.
Right.
So a country that otherwise would likely be using coal. So the gas market is going to develop, and it's going to develop further, and I think it's going to accelerate in the next few years.
Talk a little bit as we get to this issue, and I wanted to come back to it, of centralized versus dispersed grids. You have
Sure.
a couple of places in the book where you talk about what happens when the grid goes out and how quickly a country can regress. And one recent example that you talk about is Puerto Rico. And the big hurricane, I mean, that was just, a massive hurricane. The power grid there had been kind of jury rigged for many, many years. It was in terrible shape and it was just knocked to pieces by the hurricane. Talk a little bit about what happened there and how how people adapted and, some of the things they had to do in order to survive.
Yeah. Puerto Rico is, it's an emotional subject for me because I'd never been there before. And the people were so incredibly friendly, and they're Americans. They're American citizens, and they're on American soil. And some of them were without power for 7 months. When we got to Puerto Rico, there were areas, and I interviewed a woman in the book and also in the film, Edith Ortiz, and they had been living for months just using a small gasoline-fired generator. And what was the problem there? Well, one of the key problems was integrity. We can talk about Puerto Rico all day, whether it should be a state or not, but they have bad governance, right? Integrity is a problem there. But one of the things that was clear there, and what we saw in India, what we saw in Lebanon, wherever we went, was that people will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And climate change is not their first priority. And I asked Edith later, I asked her, well, are you concerned about climate change? She says, sure. But she needed that gasoline-fired generator, and they could only run it 5 hours a day because that was all they could afford. So the grids, as I think about it, as I put it, electric grids will shrink to the size where integrity is assured. And ultimately, that may, at the smallest grid, may be just one that's right outside your door because nobody's going to steal it.
Well, I mean, that point I think is a very interesting one because you've started to see there's been a lot of talk about the vulnerabilities of the U.S. grid. One of the things that, and I'll use telecommunications here as an example, as the cellular technology began to advance in a lot of countries, and I'm thinking, say, of Central America, I remember this in particular, they didn't go down and lay traditional phone lines. They went right to cellular because it was easier. It was more efficient. They didn't have to worry about putting in a big centralized telecommunications system. Do you see that in some form as being a way forward to help maybe accelerate some of this as well as a protection against centralized grids going down because of cyber attack or natural disaster or what have you?
Yeah. Well, let me just briefly mention that last part, because there was a headline the other day that China already has an EMP weapon, electromagnetic pulse weapon, that if we came to conflict, that they could deploy. And EMP, there's a book, William Forsythe's book. It's called 1 Second After, where it's a fictional book, but talks about what the United States would look like if it were hit by an electromagnetic pulse. Because it would disable the grid. I mean, it would fry the transformers and much of the electronics in the country. But that risk of blackout is real. And it is one that scares the pants off of security people, because they know that society fundamentally depends on the electric grid. And our enemies know that too. So that's a key vulnerability. And I don't know whether I'm answering your question. You got me onto blackouts, but I'm
one of the ways that we compensate for that, and also perhaps accelerate maybe the development of grids that can be sustainable in countries through a less centralized, more dispersed, sort of deployment.
Microgrids, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that there's no doubt that we're going to see more microgrids develop. And I think that as battery prices come down, that's going to be more attractive, because people like the idea of being independent of the grid, that they can plug in if they want to, but they don't want to be completely dependent. And so, but we already see that with a lot of companies having their own grids. Like I said, we talked about earlier with Amazon, Facebook, the rest of it. They can rely on the grid, but they can also make sure they can rely on their own grid. So I don't doubt that these microgrids are going to proliferate. And it was one of the things we saw in Beirut, where, and in the Shuf Mountains, where people were creating their own grids because they were competing with very high priced and very unreliable electricity from the grid. And for them, a microgrid made perfect sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I've seen a lot of talk about that, by not just crazy survivalist types, but people who say, hey, that's maybe a way we can, kind of compensate for vulnerabilities, or maybe get things spun up faster, going forward. We have one question that talks about, do you see, I mean, we talked about growth and the demand growth that's going to take place, in the countries that are lagging behind from a, terawattage standpoint, as well as the ones that like ourselves that are going to have new demands coming from new industries. Do you see any technology out there that, aside from helping to deal with this increased demand, can perhaps also help the generation of energy be more efficient? Is there some role for IT to play, for example, in regulating some of this in such a way that would enable us to use the energy sources more efficiently than we are now?
Well, yes, as the short answer. But remember, the U.S. electric demand has been flat now for more than a decade, right? We're not... These incremental improvements in LED lights, better refrigerators. I bought a new refrigerator. When I wrote the book, I had an old refrigerator. It was 15 years old. I bought a new one. Uses less than half as much electricity as the old one. So these incremental efficiency improvements are going to continue. But remember, the people who are already using or now using just tiny amounts of electricity, efficiency is not going to save them. It's not going to. So we have to focus on this idea. And that's one of the challenges here in the U.S. is that demand growth is pretty flat. That is not the case in Pakistan. It's not the case in India. It's not the case in South Asia. So this is the key difference as you look at the world and talk about this problem, is that you have a huge disparity in both the patterns of electric demand growth, and a huge disparity in geography and in available fuel. So that's going to be part of the challenge that we're going to have to deal with in the coming decades.
Well, suppose we have a new administration that comes to power, and as a result of the election of 2020, and Robert Bryce was all of a sudden just, they said, we would like you to be Secretary of Energy. What would be the couple of things that you would do, or the government should do right off the bat, to really kind of ensure that we have the ability to meet all this?
Fire the Secretary of Energy.
You
can't fire me, I quit. Jay, I've thought about this a lot. And, one of the things that's really remarkable about what has happened in the United States is that we have never had an overarching energy policy, and we've still managed to stumble through. The shale revolution wasn't mandated by government.
Absolutely.
It was some accidents, and it was some persistence by George Mitchell. It was a lot of private capital, a lot of which was just flat wasted. You know, the last decade and a half, shale revolution has made oil and gas in the United States ridiculously cheap, and the oil and gas sector went broke doing it. You know, which is just a truly remarkable thing. But, you know, I've joked about firing myself, and I probably would. But if I could do one thing truly at the Department of Energy, it would be to get more focus and a more rapid development of new nuclear technologies, because I'm adamant about this. I'm adamantly pro natural gas and nuclear end to end. If we're serious about decarbonizing, serious about scale, serious about bringing more electricity to people that don't have it, natural gas and nuclear are the ways forward. But nuclear needs strong governmental support. And unfortunately, it doesn't have it because there's a big bipartisan divide. The Democrats, you have to go back to 1972 to find a positive statement of the Democratic Party platform about nuclear energy. I'm not saying that as a partisan, but but partisanship pervades these kinds of issues. So that's
Robert, we'll stop there.
Yep.
The book is A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations by Robert Bryce. Thank you, sir, for being here with us today, and to our participants.
Yep. And thank you, Jay. And Robert, before we sign off, I want you to tell people more about your podcast.
Sure. It's just started. I've just released the third issue. I need to point out that, Jim, you have a podcast called Global IQ, which I'm
Thank you very much. Yeah, we promote each other.
We can scratch each other's backs from Dallas to Austin.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm excited about it. You know, I've thought about having a podcast for a long time, and I finally decided to launch it. I've now had the third episode out. Matt Ridley and I talked about his new book about innovation. We released a podcast last week with Michael Schellenberger talking about his new book, Apocalypse Never.
Oh, great. I've heard that's a really good book.
It's a very interesting, I think it's an important book, but it's called the Power Hungry Podcast. Power Hungry Podcast. You can find it on my website. You can find it on Buzzsprout.
And then you got the movie too, and I just looked it up on Prime Video. So that's How Electricity Explains the World.
I'm the king of all media.
We can just spend the whole weekend keeping up with Robert Bryce. Huh? So let me thank Sano Blocker, our mutual friend, and Vistra Energy for supporting today's program. Want to wish everybody a safe week and hope to see you soon. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.